So steward ownership and open source is a match made in heaven. But of course, most people that are involved with the open source community don't even realize that constructions like this exist. But they need to, because, with, our times changing and with these technological innovations, you need these business models that will support the commons, right? And we haven't done it too much up until now. But if you look now at the developments, Signal has become steward owned. Proton has become steward owned. Mastodon has become steward owned. We've got a wave here, and finally awareness is starting to spread that we need to equally reform these business models in order to preserve and protect our open source.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to industry leaders and experts about the past, present, and future of DevSecOps and AI security. We aim to help you bring developers and security together to build secure applications while moving fast and having fun. This podcast is brought to you by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down. Snyk makes it easy to find and fix vulnerabilities in code, open source dependencies, containers, and infrastructure as code, all while providing actionable security insights and administration capabilities. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Secure Developer. I'm Danny Allen, CTO at Snyk, and I am super excited to be with you here today because I'm joined with another former pen tester and someone who has built a super interesting business model at Radically Open Security, and that is Dr. Melanie Rieback. Melanie, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi. I wouldn't say I'm a former pen tester.
Well, is it true, though, that you have a background in security and security analysis?
I'm still working in security and security analysis. I'm running a 50-person pen testing company. So I absolutely still consider myself to be a pen tester. Although that being nuanced, of course, I'm management these days. So I'm just a slightly more obsoleted pen tester than I used to be. But yes, I've been in the field for 25 years. I'm a former assistant professor of computer science from the Free University of Amsterdam, also where I was doing research on, at the time, on RFID security and privacy. So yes, but I've been involved with security for 25 years. So.
Yeah, I love the security space, and probably like yourself, while I say am a pen tester, it's been a long while since I've actually been engaged in an actual penetration effort. You get into management, and I guess that's the way it goes. Now, is it true that you're still teaching? I know that you have an academic background. Did I read correctly that you're an assistant professor as well in Amsterdam?
So I was an assistant professor at the Free University until 2012, and that was basically teaching in computer science. So I was in the computer systems group, and I taught computer operating systems and sometimes security. After that, I moved over to the industry. So I worked for Citrix, I worked for ING Bank, and after that, I started my own cybersecurity company. So that was 10 years ago that I started the company. Nowadays, I do still teach, but I actually teach a different topic. I teach now as a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam Business School, and I'm actually teaching something called Post Growth Entrepreneurship, which is basically I talk about not-for-profit business models. And basically just sort of teach ways that we can make kind of next generation social enterprises and how we can move past the Silicon Valley model of startup incubation.
Well, I'd love to dive into that because having been in the security space for a while and building lots of software, it is extremely unusual to have an organization that is not for profit in this space. And I'm a personal believer that it actually results in a much long-lasting organization. These exponential companies that are being built now out of Silicon Valley, they're not optimized for long-term sustainability. So I guess let's just start. What's the motivation in a not-for-profit type of organization, whether it be security or not?
Yeah. So when I started the company a little over 10 years ago, I think my primary motivation was just a bit of discontent with the market leaders at the time. And there were a few things that had bothered me. The first was just that I was working at the time in the cybercrime team at ING Bank, and we had a DDoS incident, and some consultants had appeared and basically said, along the lines of, stand back, we'll fix the problem for you and give you a big report and a big bill at the end. And I was like, great guys, if you're so elite, I'm sure I can learn something from you. So I would be very interested in looking over your shoulder. And then they didn't seem very interested in letting me do this. Eventually, I did look over their shoulders, and, they were using the same open source as everyone else, but they didn't want me to know that because they want repeat business. So I wasn't super impressed by that. And the other thing also was that around that time, there was some scandals that had been happening with one of our cybersecurity companies that was building surveillance systems, and they sold it to developing countries with authoritarian leaders. And then the hacker community at the time was like, hey guys, can you stop doing that? That's not so nice. Did they stop? No, they just sold that part of the company. So between that and just working with intelligence agencies, hacking activists, selling 0 days, I mean, to me, that's weapon trade. There was a great discontent through the Dutch hacker community at that time. And I kind of noticed that, the customers aren't really happy with the lack of openness and transparency, but the hackers are also not really happy with how, the companies are behaving. And that was when I decided that, I think actually we need a social enterprise in the cybersecurity space. But when you say social enterprise, what does that mean? Because these days there's so much greenwashing, it just seems like it's some layer of marketing, over the usual toxic business models. So, the first thing that I did was fiscal construction from the Dutch church called a fiscal fundraising institution. And essentially, this was a kind of tax construction, which basically, so sometimes churches want to do a commercial spinoff. The profits go with the tax benefit back to the church. But the key here is that it forces the company to send 90% or more of their profits basically to a registered charity. So I heard about this thing and I thought, whoa, that sounds kind of interesting. And thought, maybe we can make our cybersecurity company basically the commercial spinoff, and then we can make our quote unquote church the NLNet Foundation. And NLNet is about a 35-year-old charitable institution that donates to open source projects, digital rights initiatives, and anything for an open internet. So yeah, it was a total business model hack, or maybe it was actually precisely using this construction as it was maybe meant for. But nobody had done it before with a tech company. So we figured, well, why not? Right. So we started it this way. Of course, people didn't think it was possible to run a company where you donate 90% of your profits to charity and still survive. The last 10% is basically our cash flow buffer that we use to make payroll at the end of every month. Now, don't get confused. I said that we donate 90% of our profits, not 90% of our revenue. So what that basically means is our customers pay us market conform rates. I pay market conform rates to my staff. We reinvest everything we need for growth and stability of the company, including project management, IT and infrastructure, our finance department, managerial overhead, right? And it's only after all of that has been paid and we can even create reserves for next year if there's a big expenditure coming up, that then and only then do we calculate the profits. And then at that point, 90% of that gets donated to NLNet. The last 10% stays within the company. That's our cash flow buffer, and it accumulates year on year. So it's a bit of a ballet with money. It's not the most obvious way to operate a company, but actually it's worked. And over the last 10 years, we've managed to grow to a 50-person company. We've had hundreds of customers, including everything from Google to the European Commission to the Dutch energy grid. We've pen tested COVID apps for the EU and also for several nation states during the pandemic, including the DCC, the European barcode, the QR code, basically for the apps. Yeah, and for the rest, we test for everyone, really. I mean, like core internet, like Amsterdam Internet Exchange, RIPE NCC, NRENs, but also telcos, hosting companies, just software companies, not-for-profits, startups. And also we do not-for-profit work on a zero margin basis at cost price for nonprofits, NGOs, and civil society organizations. And that's been really fantastic because we have some really wonderful nonprofit and civil society customers. We've also done pen tests on organizations like the Tor Project and Tails and Shadow Socks and Global Leaks and Ushahidi and, but it also just core Unix libraries. I mean, iTerm and, package managers like Homebrew. And I mean, we've really done a lot of, pen testing on a lot of usual suspects, really, and in open source and in civil society. And we're super proud that we can, be the kind of company that works both for big corporates, to help us keep the lights turned on, while at the same time we then use that same spinning flywheel to service all the smaller organizations and more sensitive organizations that also need the same kinds of services, but might not have the same budget.
I love the ethics and motivation behind starting the company there, especially because I've also witnessed kind of the sale of 0 days, and I don't want to call out organizations, but Pegasus and things that are happening in the space that are questionable ethics. And so I love the motivation behind it. A couple of things I want to touch on, though. You mentioned you had 50 employees. When you're building an organization like this, are they employees of Radically Open Security, or are they contractors that you pull in per engagement? Like, how do you scale up to hire 50 people if you're a not-for-profit organization giving away 90% of the profits?
Right. So we do work more with contractors in that sense. I think Radically Open Security is kind of more of a collective in that sense. But it was necessary because, I bootstrapped the company without capital. So basically working with contractors in the beginning was the only way to do it. As the company grew, I made a few offers to some of the contractors to work full time. And they were like, what? You want us to work more hours for the same money? So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So in that sense, we've kind of maintained the structure that we have. It works really well. We also partner with other SMEs as well, other pen testing companies also, to sort of swap capacity. And it's really, it's just a system that works. We basically build, platforms that are kind of win-win amongst those who are participating. Everyone who's involved is also super. It's not just that we have cool customers, but it's also just that, seeing that 90% go to NLnet. We've donated also over the last 10 years over 1 million euros to NLnet. Yeah. And a large part of that also went to helping them with also partnering with the European Commission on something called the Next Generation Internet NGI Zero project, which actually wound up getting a bunch of EC money, which led to, NGI Zero is actually the largest funding initiative for open source, not just in Europe, but in the entire world. So there's been literally 1,000 projects, over 1,000, that have been funded by NGI Zero. No, that's not all from our donations. That's from the EC money. But of course, it was our donations also to NLnet that gave them the financial freedom to be able to work on those grant applications and also manage the project. So in that sense, I think actually our donations have really had a kind of multiplier effect. And and just the kinds of projects that are getting funded. It's just all the freedom tools, all the just open source things that are the glue, here in Europe, of course, it's also of great importance. Also just to try and stimulate the open source ecosystem. For so many reasons. In part because of geopolitics, which of course at the moment is quite the lively topic. But even beyond that, also just looking at supply chain security, SBOMs. You can sell all the proprietary stuff you like, but it's still going to have open source under the hood. And if you're also relying on critical national infrastructure, as all of us are, then it also means you need to care for the health and maintenance of open source projects as well.
It's one of the major shifts that I've seen in the development community, at least over the last 20 years, is we've gone from proprietary software to 90% of the stack now is open source components. And I would argue actually there'd be benefit if the remaining 10% were contributed to the open source, because the differentiation is probably not in the code that is written, but more in the delivery of the services to the organizations. And actually, I guess that's a question for you, Melanie. the model that you built works very well in a services-based company. Could or would the model work as well in a software-based company to be, completely open in the way that you are? Because often you need your cash up front in a software organization because you don't have software to start, where services you can often start on day one. Or is that a myth? Am I not understanding it correctly?
Yeah. That's a very good question. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. You can use services to bootstrap product. We've done that in my own company. By delivering cybersecurity services, we essentially kind of almost like crowdfunded, the production of a pen testing documentation and automation system. Because we didn't have any investors that put up capital for it, it basically meant we were able to open source it and give the whole thing away for free. And we even made it an OWASP project. So it's called OWASP Pentext. That's one example. However, of course, there are things that you cannot bootstrap in that way. And I think in those particular cases, there's two other things we need to consider. One is that venture capitalists, finance itself can also be reformed. So I'm a big advocate of a business model that's known as steward ownership. So steward ownership, essentially what this means is that the real definition is that you're separating profit rights from voting rights. So what it means is that if anyone is extracting financial value out of the company, they don't also hold voting shares that exercise voting control over the operations of the company. So, but you can have stronger versions of this, which also include something called asset locks, which basically means that you are locking the value of the company inside the company. So very frequently this happens with constructions that are known as golden shares. And what this is this is a share of voting stock with voting rights, but no profit rights, that enables the holder to veto certain governance operations. And this can be things like mergers and acquisitions, dividends out of the company, even just changes in your mission and statutes, if you wish. Basically, what this means is we're trying to create a company where you literally are locking the value of the company inside the company, which means that everything is then reinvested. Now, the interesting part is that you can do the same thing with investment funds. So you can actually take a VC fund and then apply a steward ownership model to it. And then what you can do also is VCs are paid by fees, basically. So if a company grows exponentially and exits, they will tend to get 20% of this. It's known as carried interest. And there's also a 2% management fee on the money of their investors, the limited partners generally. Now, the point is you can change this fee structure. So you basically get rid of this carried interest. In other words, you get rid of the incentive to grow exponentially and exit with these portfolio companies. And then you also reform the 2% into the cost of running the business, assuming middle-class salaries and a pension. Now, the point here is what you're actually doing is you're creating a not-for-profit VC fund in the same way that Radically Open Security is a not-for-profit cybersecurity company. So what you're doing is you're fundamentally realigning incentives of the venture capitalist. Now, I think coming back to your question, if you then want to fund open source projects or any other kinds of projects in a way that they are incentivized to serve, in other words, making the world more cyber secure rather than just optimizing for growing exponentially and getting acquired, then basically, if they get funding from such a kind of financially non-extractive VC fund, then that actually sort of changes the incentives and in such a way then that the whole thing, I think, is relatively okay. And you can have longer discussions about this. I apologize that I'm getting slightly technical now with finance. But look, I mean, this stuff basically, I think the TLDR of all of this is finance and entrepreneurship itself are basically machines and that we need to take a hacker mindset to. And I think until we actually start understanding how it works, and sort of understanding how to kind of disassemble with it, tinker with it, put it back together, probably wrong. And of course, most importantly, where do we stick the ice pick, to make it behave differently? This is basically, I think, what we need to do to be able to fix capitalism. And these are really major issues. So, in that sense, I think it's of great importance for open source. because oftentimes open source gets mission drift. It goes freemium, right? We all know freemium, and most of us dislike freemium, and for those of us who've been in cybersecurity for a long time, maybe we can remember the moments back when Nessus was free, completely open source and free, back when Metasploit was free, back when Snort was free, back when, I can go on, and these discussions, don't go away. I mean, we're having that same discussion now with SemGrip. So the point here is, part of the reason why this whole movement towards freemium is happening, and then we're lucky, as consumers, if they don't just torpedo, the true open source community version at a certain point, and a large part of why this happens is because of the incentives that are embedded by VCs. So steward ownership and open source is a match made in heaven. But of course, most people that are involved with the open source community don't even realize that constructions like this exist. But they need to, because, with our times changing and with these technological innovations, you need these business models that will support the commons, right? And we haven't done it too much up until now. But if you look now at the developments, Signal has become steward owned. Proton has become steward owned. Mastodon has become steward owned. We've got a wave here, and finally awareness is starting to spread that we need to equally reform these business models in order to preserve and protect our open source.
Well, I love the approach, and I'm going to come back to technology in a moment. I have to ask one more philosophical question just because I'm interested. Aren't we really discussing a shifting culture away from greed? Because typically organizations right now, and I'm going to associate this with security, because I always say the technology is the easy part, right? It's the culture, shifting a culture to be security conscious. That's the hard part. And what you're really describing is a culture away from greed and profit to one of magnanimous contribution back to the community. And if you look at the business world right now, less than 1% are focused on giving back. 99% are all like profits, Wall Street. This is a philosophical question. How do you shift the culture away from a greed-based culture to a give-back-based culture? Is it just awareness, education?
Yeah. A couple things. First, if you're talking about techies and hackers and open source developers, I do not believe they're greedy. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't.
Yep.
I think most hackers and I think most open source advocates are extremely passionate. And I think they are not greedy at all. This is why they choose for open source in the first place. They care about building something great. They care about getting it used. They care about making the world better. That is not a culture that we need to change. That's a culture that's already there. Now, the problem, though, is that when we try valorizing open source, if you had, for example, a grant or subsidy funded project, most of the time what happens is they will start up incubators, the Y Combinators of the world, and they will pair them up with VCs. And the moment that a VC gets involved, it's a lost cause. You've basically, lost before you've started, because it irrevocably embeds, this financialization into the company in a way that the open source project founder never intended. But the problem is they don't understand enough about what's happening with incubation and with investment and with venture capital until they've been through it once, until they've been through the roller coaster, and then they realize when they get spat out at the end that, hey, wait a minute, this didn't end well. But the problem is most, techies don't care about business and they don't want to think about business because quote unquote money is evil, right? I mean, so many of us kind of are a bit anti-capitalist that, but the problem is we need to know because what you don't know can hurt you, right? Same with security, right? So, so the point is, we need to actually understand the threat model that we have here. and most developers do not. And look, I'm not meaning to say either that the venture capitalists are bad, because most of them are also really great people. They're the kinds of people you can have a beer with if you meet them. Many of them care. Many of them care deeply. But the problem is they too are embedded into a system, and it's good people embedded into a toxic system. Because even the venture capitalists, they have this pesky thing called fiduciary responsibility, which makes them legally liable, like literally criminally liable, if they do not, maximize the, well, I mean, you can interpret fiduciary, what fiduciary responsibility means, but it's typically, particularly in the States, interpreted as pecuniary factors. Yeah. And so the point is, even if they are well-meaning and want to do it differently, they literally can't because they're also held hostage in the same structure. And even their investors, the limited partners, and also, pension funds, and, they too are caught in their own structures. So the problem is not the people who are mostly well-meaning. The problem is the system. Right. And we know that the system's the problem. We know that, the problems are systemic. But then when you ask people, what is the system? They can't tell you. They don't know. And the devil is always in the details. So the point is that we really need to study these details, in order to, and look, not everyone has to study them, because most of us are probably busy hacking stuff or creating software. But what we can do, though, is build upon the great work of those who have studied it, right? The same way with open source contracts, we have leaned upon the wonderful work that was done, by the Richard Stallmans, and the Eric Raymonds, and the Linus Torvalds, and, all the people who really have put so much thought into open source, into licensing, and into how to build community. That's great. But also for these new business models now, there's similar people thinking about it, like the Purpose Foundation, that's spending a lot of time on steward ownership as a concept. And of course, that also follows in the legacy of, the cooperative movement, also foundation ownership, which has gone way, way, way back. Not just to European historical examples like in Scandinavia, but the concept of endowments, and this goes all the way back to like biblical times. So we've been considering how to make self-owned companies or more sort of common good oriented companies forever. It's just that it seems in the last 50 years like we've forgotten.
Yeah, it's and I think you've started in the right place, because the one thing that I strongly agree with is that the security people have an anti-system mentality. How do I break it? How do I give back? And it's not greed, to your point. In fact, it's why you sometimes see hackers that hack for political means, mostly because they're angry with, the other side. Now, again, I think I would stay out of that myself, but I agree with you. It's not greed based. It's actually more altruistic in nature. So if you're going to start a company that is looking at this, you're a software developer, you're going to build a company around this. I can imagine that you run into issues with building a culture, especially if you have a lot of contractors or wrangling herding the cats, whatever the term is. How do you do that in a nonprofit with a lot of contractors to set a culture that puts everyone pointed in the same direction? Because I assume that you had to fight with this as you were starting the company, Radically Open Security.
Yeah. I think culture is difficult no matter what your governance structure is. Just right. Because of course you are dealing with people, and people, I'm your usual sort of semi-autistic tech geek. So like my motto is like, technology is easy, people are hard.
Yes.
But how have I done it? In part by trying to lead by example, and in part by making a whole lot of mistakes. That's what it is. Anytime you start something, absolutely, you're going to be doing things wrong. You're sometimes going to have conflicts with people. You're sometimes, going to get up on the wrong side of the bed and say that thing you regret later. It's just, it happens to all of us. I think that it helps if you can embrace things like horizontal organization. So I'm a very large believer in methodologies like holacracy and sociocracy. And I use a somewhat hybrid form of holacracy within my own company. It's still hierarchical, I think, at the center of the governance, just because you still need directors that are written into the Chamber of Commerce. But you can try and find your own balance with that. And then beyond that, I mean, what I've done with sort of post growth entrepreneurship, which is sort of this methodology for quote unquote not for profit businesses or non-extractive businesses. I've attempted in that sense to create almost a kind of culture document for the company. I in part, wrote everything down because for myself to scratch my own itch with it. And then also in part, a whole lot of other founders were approaching me saying, "Hey, Melanie, I would like to create a similar company. Could you help?" So, that was when I really developed the whole methodology. I also put it in the larger macroeconomic framework of new economics and well-being economy, just because I felt like it fit really well. And I think you need to be a little careful about some of the terms, though, like degrowth in particular has gotten super politicized and is quite widely misunderstood these days. But so I typically use the term post-growth instead, but even that is getting politicized now. But I think really just the point is just, again, like really realigning incentives and really taking a systems thinking perspective to entrepreneurship. And I think that's really the core and the essence of it.
Do you think that type of software company is more in line with people who have experience or maturity in the space? Or do you think that there's a model here for new graduates coming out of school to be entrepreneurs in this type of organization? I haven't seen a lot of it in the United States. Maybe there's more in Europe. I guess is it more in line with people that are further along in their career or early, or doesn't matter?
Yeah. So, I mean, first I'll start with employees. I think that anybody can be employed by a company like this because we basically just take other people along for the ride as entrepreneurs, and plenty of my, hackers at Radically Open Security, some of them don't really care, about this stuff. And, they just want to break stuff. So
a paycheck's a paycheck, and I like breaking software.
That's it. And they shouldn't need to be interested in more than that. I mean, like that should be enough because that's what the company does. And beyond that, I mean, as for the founders themselves, I found personally that there's a greater resonance with people later in their careers, just because younger people tend to see startups portrayed very romantically on places like Netflix, and just, sort of pop culture kind of, you sell your company, get lots of bling, buy your Lambo, whatever it is, it's, it just resonates with some young people, not all of them, but some of them. But I think though that once people are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, the honeymoon's over because, we've worked, for corporates for a while. We've perhaps also worked in startups. We've seen what happens also with venture capitalists and when things are acquired, maybe we've been through it before. I mean, there's even founders who have sold their companies and had a bad experience with it and then said, next time I'm going to do it differently. So I think that in that sense, it's going to be easier for those who are older and who have more life experience and work experience. I mean, I think anyway, older founders are more successful in general anyway, for precisely the set of reasons. But I think for the younger people, it's more just anxiety. I mean, climate anxiety, just polycrisis anxiety. Yeah. I mean, there's a certain number of them too, I think, who would be interested in exploring this. But of course, they still do need to accumulate the life experience to be able to, I think, have the insights in the network and the experience also to understand how to pull this off. And I would never say that young people can't. Of course, young people can. Yeah. And some of them are very charismatic and very energetic, and most certainly they can. But I do think, though, that older people have an unfair advantage.
My career trajectory, I started in the public sector as a complete idealist. Now, I went over to the private sector 25 years ago because I had issues with some of the things that were happening in the public sector that I'm probably not supposed to talk about in the military intelligence space. But I can see why after a period of time in the public sector, the private sector, you want to go back to build this type of organization. Who do you hold up? What software organization do you hold up as being an example of an organization that has done this well? Or are there big organizations in the software space that you would say are close to this model or near this model?
Yeah. I think a really nice one is Mozilla.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, they're they're a wonderful hybrid between a foundation and a commercial company.
No, I like that. Yeah, Mozilla has always had an impressive ethos towards building browsers, and it's actually resulted, I would argue, in perhaps better privacy policies and security policies than some of the commercial browsers that you see. So that
Absolutely.
is a great example.
Yeah. I mean, another thing also is if you consider things like Shadow Server, I mean, they're run as a foundation. I mean, Team Cymru was also that kind of a hybrid for quite a while. National Sea Certs,
Yep.
I mean, that's all, I mean, it's public sector, but if you consider some of also the wonderful innovations and software, if you consider like threat intel sharing and MISP, and, a lot of that has come out of National Sea Cert teams. So I think that there's absolutely, a lot of wonderful innovation also coming out of sort of more not-for-profit oriented kinds of organizations. But I think we just don't pay attention to that enough.
I love the conversation and the topic. Usually we delve into coding and security and those types of things, but I think it's a higher level meta point on the industry itself, on how it can evolve. Maybe just finish up on that. What has you most excited about where the industry is going? Do you see hope in the future for better software organizations and a realignment towards a post-growth world? And the reason I say this is my own belief is that the current growth trajectories of software companies is unsustainable in the long term. Like, it can't keep going. It's going to burn people out. It's going to burn the industry out. Maybe you disagree with that, but what gets you out of bed in the morning? What makes you optimistic for the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, what makes me optimistic is that really awareness of the importance of governance and ownership is spreading. And it was like I mentioned before with the gradual adoption by some of these prominent digital liberty kinds of projects, right? It's people are saying this, and it's sort of the snowball is starting to roll down the mountain. And I think as people see it, we'll build more mind share and it'll become more normal to do. So I think that is going to grow in adoption. I also think some of our national efforts that we're also having, I mean, the fact that now also in Europe, we have basically steward ownership legal form initiatives that have made it through the parliaments in multiple EU nation states. I mean, Germany basically was the first, the Netherlands is the next one, but, hopefully this is also going to continue spreading in more locations, right? I mean, because we actually started the whole thing just by putting up a petition, and that was sort of enough to get the issue raised in the parliament, and it got through successfully on a vote. So basically, I think more EU nation states, can easily start to pick this up. I think also even the US, I know it's not going to be the lowest hanging fruit, but I think that at least, by the act of trying, we can at least really start to put it on people's radars. And the thing is, we need to make sure it also doesn't become politicized, because it's very easy also, I think, to stamp this kind of stuff as, oh, it's idealistic, woke, but it doesn't have to be like that. Because if you also consider things like geopolitical factors and national security, then you start also understanding why corporate governance is important. I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, I mean, we had one incident where there was a company making monitoring boxes. And at a certain point, the company, basically the boxes were all throughout defense, the corporate world, and eventually they got acquired by the British. And then the entire Dutch ecosystem let out sort of a collective like, oh shit, our data is going to the British, like, hello, GCHQ. So, they all jumped ship and then moved over to a different startup that had actually spun out of the same company that was making similar monitoring boxes. And they figured, well, at least it's a good Dutch startup, right? And then, of course, what happened next is predictable, right? They go to the incubator, they get a VC, and then 2 years later, I really read the press release. Yeah, congratulations to this other startup. They just got acquired by the Romanians, leading us to ask the question of like, will we ever learn? And yeah, it actually turns out the Dutch government did learn, because they started requiring Dutch cybersecurity companies that were involved in critical national Dutch infrastructure to give a golden share to the government to prevent them from being able to sell to other unauthorized companies. So really posing it in this way, I mean, do we want our young tech companies that we're incubating to be sold, in the case of Europe, do we want it to be sold to the States? Do we want it to be sold to China? Do we want, and it is a matter of national sovereignty, both data sovereignty as well as just operational sovereignty for serving our own citizens. Similarly, also in the Netherlands, there was a company that had built vaccines, and it was a spinoff from Leiden University. And then, of course, they went through valorization, but then they went to the academic incubator, got hooked up to the VC. Of course, what happens next is predictable. They grow exponentially, get acquired by the Americans. Then along comes the pandemic, and then suddenly vaccines are a really hot topic. But the U.S. owners of the company forced this Dutch company to serve the U.S. market before it was allowed to serve the Dutch market. So we really need to be asking ourselves the question of, are we actually serving our own country? And why is it that we're enabling foreign interests, to interfere with our local companies? And how do we keep keep companies Dutch? How do we keep American companies American? And in this sense, I mean, it can be a bit populist too. So, and I think we need to be able to explore it and also to respect it from all of these angles.
Well, I love what you are doing. I don't think before this podcast I've heard of very many not-for-profit security organizations, let alone security development. But I do think the concept is very appropriate, and not just in Europe, but in American models as well. And like you, I believe that most security people and developers in general actually are give back contribution type people. In fact, probably many of the people listening to this podcast are. So thank you for sharing it. If they want to learn more information about the corporate structure, where do they best learn that, Melanie? Is it on Radically Open Security, or do you have a different location that you point people towards?
Yep. So good question. So I run a startup incubator called Nonprofit Ventures. You can basically find it at nonprofit.ventures. I have also, I mentioned earlier that I teach a class called Post Growth Entrepreneurship at the University of Amsterdam Business School. I recorded 2 years ago the entire class, and I put it for free online on YouTube with a Creative Commons license. So it is an entire, that's the model. So basically it's 11 hours of content. So it's a considerable sit, but if you really, really, really want to understand how business and finance works from this kind of a lens, I would highly recommend that you have a look at these videos. Another thing that I've also seen people doing also is starting watching groups for these videos. And what they're doing is they're meeting with, let's say, a dozen people, and they're just like going through 1 or 2 videos a week and then having guided discussions on it. And that's also sort of a way to be able to get your own little like mini, learning circle going in your own local areas, as well as also discussing how to apply this also to your own context, whether it's your own geographic location or your own industry. So,
well, that's fantastic, Melanie. Thank you for that. And we'll put a link in the show notes to those resources. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of The Secure Developer. I love the conversation today, and let's go out and change the world as we build software securely and more efficiently.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to The Secure Developer, brought to you by Sneak. We hope this episode gave you new insights and strategies to help you champion security in your organization. If you like these conversations, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share the episode with fellow security leaders who might benefit from our discussions. We'd love to hear your recommendations for future guests, topics, or any feedback you might have to help us get better. Please contact us by connecting with us on LinkedIn under our Sneak account, or by emailing us at thesecuredev@sneak.io. That's it for now. I hope you join us for the next one.